Ahora sí, listo. Estamos ya en vivo en YouTube. Le cedo la palabra al doctor Milton.
Gracias, muchas gracias, Wendy. Well, this conference is going to be held in English. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Escuela Superior de Ingeniería y Arquitectura del Instituto Politécnico Nacional, Unidad TECA Machalco, we warmly welcome you to the conference of today, of this afternoon. This session is going to be held in English, and it's for me a great honor to introduce our guest speaker of today, Dr. Christina Ann Boyce. Dr. Boyce holds a PhD in International Relations and Public Policy. She's a professor at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, at the Department of International Studies in Mexico City. She was a researcher at the Political Science Department at the University of Colorado Boulder and an Oscar Morgenstern and Don Lavoie Fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center. Her subject of interest are the interstate and intrastate security and conflict processes and the role of natural resources in such processes. Also, she researches the strategic decisions of political actors in conflict and the interaction of politics and the natural environment. We are delighted to hear the conference of today that has the title Housing Inequalities and Ethnic Tensions in the Former Yugoslavia, a preliminary case study of Scotia, Macedonia. We are very glad to receive Dr. Boyce. Please, Dr. Boyce, the audience is all yours.
Gracias, doctor Milton. Mucho gusto a todos. Sí voy a presentar en inglés, pero esa parte la voy a dar en español tantito. Quiero agradecer a la invitación de estar aquí con ustedes y el tiempo. Y espero que les guste lo que voy a presentar. Me hace que el tema del coloquio en general es arquitectura y planeación urbana. Y el trabajo mismo de lo cual voy a hablar trata de una investigación totalmente interdisciplinaria entre políticas públicas, relaciones internacionales y planeamiento urbano. Entonces, ojalá les agrade. Una disculpa por la falta de cámara, es que mi laptop se acaba de romper, entonces estoy usando un compu prestado y espero que todo transmite bien y sirve bien. Bueno, ahorita voy a cambiar a inglés. Okay, the title of today's talk is Housing Inequalities and Ethnic Tensions in the Former Yugoslavia, a preliminary case study of Scorpio, Macedonia. My co-authors are Alexandra Kristich. She is a doctor of architecture and urban planning. She is at the Tecnológico de Monterrey. And Dr. Srinivas C. Parnandi, who is a doctor of public policy and American politics, and he's at the University of Colorado Boulder. So we started with a research question. Did housing distribution affect ethnic tensions prior to and during the breakdown of Yugoslavia? And if so, how? We wanted to take a look at this question because frequently when you look at conflict processes, what's discussed is the concept of grievances and how the population might be upset or aggrieved with the government and therefore willing to fight both with each other and with the government. But very few people have taken the time to examine the specific aspects of grievances. What are they and how do they evolve? What grievances matter and which ones don't? And what does the process of conflict look like at the micro level? And those are the types of questions we started to want to get at with this research. What I'm presenting is not a completed project. This is a research design and preliminary results of our qualitative investigation. We've yet to complete the quantitative analyses. So beginning with the politics of urban planning. It's known that poor and minority communities frequently receive fewer or lower quality public services. But there's one problem with this particular aspect of investigation. It's almost exclusively based on the examination of Western cities. It doesn't necessarily look at what happens in planned economies. And we do know that equitable service provision can alleviate grievances. So we know that when a grievance occurs, you can tackle it a little on the part of the state by providing public services. So states can basically buy favor from their populations. And housing policies are one aspect of this. So government housing policies also have negative impacts as well, though. They can increase racial tension and ethnic tension, and can also institutionalize racism. But once again, this is coming from a Western context. So we know within the United States and other Westernized countries, we've seen the amplification of social problems in relation to things like the lack of green space in an environment. But we haven't necessarily seen what happens outside of those contexts. And we know that the urban planning of parks and urban services is dominated, like I said, by these studies of Western cities. But centralized economies are more deliberate, they're less organic, and in theory, the planning that they do helps to eliminate or alleviate the types of tensions that we're likely to see. However, we have reason to believe that that's not necessarily the case. And when we look at the context of the former Yugoslavia, we're comparing the Western world, capitalist societies, with socialist views of the state's role in housing distribution. The capitalist model argues that free market housing is the way that housing should be taken care of. We also see several Westernized states violating this principle and violating this capitalist ideology. You see, for example, the United States in the 1950s and 60s investing heavily in subsidized housing, actually beginning in the 1940s, post-war, there was a drive to provide housing for former soldiers and then for the public in general, beginning in the 50s and 60s. And we see that continue through the early 80s, at least in the United States context, there's this state provision of housing. And the socialist model is closer to that. It's housing by the state or housing as the state's responsibility. However, what's not understood is that central planning aspect in the overall economy. The former Yugoslavia was a centralized economy with housing provided by the state and by state-run enterprises and the military directly. So this is not a model where we see private enterprise stepping in. This is where we see the government and government-owned companies saying this is where you will build and how you will build. And these are the regulations we'll put in place to determine who gets houses. In urban settings, it was based on merit and need. Now I put merit in quotation marks here because the idea of merit frequently we think of as something that anyone is able to acquire and demonstrate. But merit in this particular context was sometimes based on standards such as education, which weren't equally accessible for all groups. Certain minorities had privileged access to education in the former Yugoslavia, and some minorities were considered as potentially not being interested in having higher levels of education. This automatically provided them with a lower score on what we would call the merit scale, and fewer points possible for actually acquiring housing. And we see multiple minority groups present in Macedonia. According to the 1994 census, we have a population that was 66.5% Macedonian, 22.9% Albanian, 4% Turk, 2.3% Roma, and 2% Serb. It's important to note here that besides the Albanians, the Turks were the only minority capable of actually exerting influence on politics. And they didn't really have much interest. The Roma also weren't very interested. They would have been the next largest minority. In fact, the Roma were so disenfranchised, they largely disengaged from the political process. And the number of Turks is also questioned because another minority, the Vlachs, is not represented in this census. And we know that many Vlachs were incentivized to represent themselves as Turks. So the actual number of Turk minority may be smaller than we see here. And we also know that there was a 2% Serb population. What we see is a highly fractionalized and polarized society with a hyper concentration of ethnic minorities in limited geographic spaces. And this is important because in the study of interstate conflict, one of the arguments that's made is that fractionalization can increase conflict, while we also see the argument that polarization can increase conflict. To see both in the same context makes it likely that we're going to see some sort of political violence take place here. Now, the ethnic tensions in Skopje themselves are also worth diving into a little bit and exploring. The tensions were highest with the largest minority group for the reasons mentioned on the previous slide, and that's with the Albanians, just to remind you. Some radical portions of the Albanian minority were seeking independence and unification with greater Albanian populations across multiple regions of the former Yugoslavia. What they wanted to do with that unification with the larger Albanian population varied. Some of these individuals wanted to create an Albanian Yugoslav republic, much like the Serbian Republic, the Bosnian Republic, or to unify with Albania. Those are two very distinct goals, and the groups pushing them were very different groups, although the perception from the Macedonian majority was frequently that all Albanians wanted one of those goals. We also see other minority groups being too small to exert influence. As I mentioned, the Roma were too disenfranchised to even start to get involved. But Albanians had some access to resources, so they knew what existed to an extent and what the Macedonian majority was receiving. So they could receive some education, but not much. They were not the primary beneficiaries of any benefits that existed under Yugoslav socialism. That's important to note here because they were not one of the populations that had its own republic. They were not a population that was catered to in the same way as perhaps the Serbians or the Bosnians. Geographically, however, Albanians were concentrated within the former Macedonia in old pre-war housing and villages around Skopje. So they were aware of what existed and the benefits of it, but the housing that they lived in was frequently of lower quality. And it was the areas that Macedonians didn't necessarily want to occupy. So we present a theory of the socio-political consequences of spatial inequalities. How housing is distributed can have profound impacts on the structure and composition of a community and may create or disrupt patterns of imposed or self-segregation. Public and social sector housing is not immune to segregation. Some research suggests that as state repression becomes increasingly indiscriminate and repression increases, the likelihood of civil conflict also increases. So when systematic bias exists surrounding housing distribution, grievances can emerge and be salient for political violence. The decision of where to plan new settlements, who should be assigned housing and of what quality, and the political determinants of residential relocation policies can inadvertently or intentionally have disproportionate impacts on subgroups of a population. This can, in turn, exacerbate existing tensions. Housing policy, therefore, can also be expected to have very far-reaching effects. One potential way that housing distribution can alter violence locations is by altering the social cohesion and expectations for control in neighborhoods. For example, in a study of homicide within the city of Chicago in the United States, prior research in criminology demonstrated the impact of neighborhood cohesion and inequality on violence. The rate of homicide in 343 Chicago neighborhoods was shown to be related to the spatial distribution of previous homicides, as well as to economic disadvantage in racially segregated urban neighborhoods, and collective efficacy, which is defined as a mix of trust and social cohesion with shared expectations for control. While homicide is not the same as political violence, economic disadvantage, racial segregation, and collective efficacy can be expected to affect the spatial distribution of political violence too. For example, Larson and Lewis demonstrated in 2018 that rebel groups are more likely to form in areas where kinship networks and rumors work in their favor. Additionally, and as mentioned earlier, economic concerns have long been associated with generating grievances that enable political violence and civil conflict. Although grievances can exist for a long period of time without violence, how specific factors contributed to the fomentation of such grievances and conflict is not well understood. We argue that distributional inequality in housing can be conceived of both as a form of repression and source of grievances if systematic bias occurs against minority groups. Due to the complex ethnic relations which already existed within the Yugoslav republics, grievances would be likely to directly impact the government via civil conflict during the period immediately prior to and during the breakdown of the regime. When state-distributed housing occurred, we argued that it was not devoid of ethnic bias, and that this bias in housing allocation also helped to determine where ethnically motivated violence occurred during the breakdown of Yugoslavia. Socialism is based on the concept that the government is a benevolent planner, which cannot shirk responsibility for inequitable housing allocations. However, the system has to respond to the people. And under socialism, the system was already supposedly designed to be equitable. Therefore, perceived inequalities and inequities may be perceived as more directly tied to system problems as opposed to individual failings. And that might suggest that in this context in particular, because the Albanian minority was aware of what they were missing out on and the benefits that were given to the majority population, relative deprivation, which is unsupported in many contexts, may actually provoke violence under socialist command economies. This leads to our hypothesis that political violence is more likely to occur in neighborhoods undergoing significant changes in ethnic composition and where new housing construction is occurring. And in specific, what we're talking about here is where we see a shift to a higher non-Albanian population in an area where new housing construction is occurring. Essentially, where it's visible for minorities that they are not getting the benefit that another group is receiving. To address our question, we use a mixed methods approach. The data we use comes from the global data database, the global terror database, the UCDP georeferenced event data, and the global administrative boundaries data sets. The Macedonian census data from 1971, 1981, 1994, and 2002, as well as interviews with functionaries in charge of housing distribution in Skopje, Yugoslavia. And those functionaries, just for reference, one came from state-run enterprises and the other was military. For the quantitative analysis of North Macedonia, which is currently in progress, we plan on conducting a spatial analysis using spatial multinomial logit. And the dependent variable here is the occurrence of political violence in a given municipal area. And the independent variables we plan on using are change in ethnic composition and the number of units of new housing construction. For controls in that analysis, we'll be using change in yearly income, the average education level per municipality, educational equivalence for actual employment, and the average number of construction workers per municipality, and the number of unemployed individuals per municipality. Just to elucidate one concept here, the educational equivalence for actual employment refers to the idea that if you have, for example, a PhD in architecture, you'll be able to use that in your job versus when you have a high school education and you use your high school diploma in your job, and you're actually using the skills that you acquired in your degree in the employment that you have. So you don't, for example, have a PhD in economics and you work at a restaurant on the corner as a waiter. Okay, so for the qualitative analysis of the city of Skopje, Macedonia, we first had to consider why Skopje. And in answering that question, what we're looking at here is that there was an administrative redistricting process in 1981 that took place and divided the city into 5 municipalities following a massive influx of migrants. So this gives us a unique context that's different from the overall North Macedonian context for the rest of our studies taking place. We also see here that in 1963, a massive earthquake occurred, which led to the construction of lower quality emergency housing. And that's important to note because some of that housing was used for an extended period of time, despite the fact that it was not intended for permanent use and in fact was expressly designed for short-term use. We also see that there's more fine-grained data available for Skopje itself, and it allows us to take a closer look at what's going on. And we had contacts on the ground who were responsible for the housing distribution in this particular location. We also conducted a visual examination of locations of violence within Skopje and analysis of the quality of housing and urban planning in different parts of the city. And we do a visual analysis of changes in ethnic composition within Skopje. There's also interview data included here. I don't mention it again just because I do mention it in the overall data used for the project. So when we look at the different housing styles available, in the top left corner, we see Macedonian low-rise housing. You'll notice that there are green spaces around these housing units. There's what appears to be an ample sidewalk. People have balconies. There's satellite dishes. We don't see too many wires exposed, but there are some. We see access to a park right across the street from the housing unit. Appears to be maybe a tennis court. Clearly marked crosswalks. And essentially, it looks like a nice neighborhood. This is a Macedonian low-rise housing unit. In the top right box, we see taller buildings, but we still see that there are frequently a high number of trees in the area. There's ample parking space designed for parking. We see a street light. We don't see exposed wires, and we see what appear to be enclosed balconies for every unit of housing, despite the fact that it's a high rise. And it seems to be a nice park space as well between the buildings, right? So that's a Macedonian high rise in dense housing. When we look in the lower left corner, we see a sharp contrast with the upper left corner. In the lower left corner, we do not see any green space. We do not see sidewalks. We see several exposed wires. And although there is housing available, there isn't really necessarily any type of balcony or anything from what we can see here. It seems to be of lower quality. That's Albanian low-rise housing. And if you look across the street from it, sorry, not across the street, across the panel, in panel D, we see here that in these buildings, they appear to be mid-rise apartment buildings. There's graffiti on the walls. There are trash cans on the street where we would like to see parking. There's very few trees. They seem to be past the housing units and in a little bit of a larger section of the avenue. There are exposed wires. And while there are balconies on some units, they're not present for all. And this is an Albanian mid-rise housing unit. So the difference between the two is clear. And it appears to be that the majority population, or the area where the majority population lives, has better access to services, better access to green spaces and parks, and in general, better housing units. When we look at the changes in Skopje's ethnic composition over time, if you look at the top image here, this is Skopje in 1994. And this is the concentration of Albanian population for the different municipalities. So you'll notice that on the far left, there's one small pocket of Albanian population that's very heavily concentrated. And then if we look in the center, there's a change that takes place between the distribution of Albanian population in the very, very center districts here. So that makes us think that when we're looking at this particular image, we ought to see a change in the amount of violence that takes place in the center. And then at the same time, when we look at the far right of the image, we see that there is an increase as well here in the Albanian population. And it takes place in one particular sector, right? It takes place in the northern section here. So we're expecting to see a little more violence in those areas as well. So where the violence happens is about where we would expect it to be. It's in that center area where we see a strong population shift over towards the heavy pocket on the left that I mentioned. We don't have the data on the specific concentration of Albanian population in this area, but we do know that this is a heavily Albanian population, heavily concentrated Albanian population on the far left, where you do see the red dot for the armed incident. That's an area we know to be heavily populated by Albanians. And then on the far right, if you look within the region that I pointed out earlier, where there's the change in population, we do see violent incidents there, and in the region directly adjacent to. So we're seeing a pattern that reflects what we would expect. Our preliminary conclusions just from this initial view are tentative support for the hypothesis. There are visible differences in Albanian versus Macedonian housing units and in the urban environment around them. And we do see violence occurring predominantly in areas that underwent massive ethnic demographic shifts and the spaces immediately adjacent to these areas. So we're not surprised by these conclusions. We do have something I haven't included in the slides, some comments from individuals, the interviews that are particularly enlightening. One in particular is from a woman who was in charge of distributing housing from the state-based enterprise. And she specifically states that when housing was distributed, there wasn't racism per se, but Albanians wanted to live with their people and the Macedonians wanted to live with their people. And so there is basically racism present that helped to exacerbate this issue and this hyper concentration of populations. All right, so I want to say thank you with that, and I'm ready for any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyce. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. We are going to see if there is any question. In the meanwhile, I have some questions. Well, I have a question. Does centrality plays an important role in this recomposition, in this ethnical recomposition in the city?
Could you rephrase the question for me, Dr. Milton, in terms of centrality, a little clarification on the concept for me?
Sure. You are comparing and analyzing different moments of the city. My question is if centrality, the functional centrality of the city plays a role in this structure of the city, or does have another weight, the significance of other historical places in the city to rearrange this structure?
I'll try to respond to the question as best I can. I'm still not sure that I understand what you're getting at, but I think you're referring to the fact that the center of the city itself is where we see this violence focused. Is that the main concern?
Yes, that is.
Okay, yeah, so the center in Skopje is a little bit different. It's not like we would think of as a downtown in some cities where it's like tall high-rise buildings and you might expect more like center city or urban type crime. It actually is a series of lower buildings that were pre-war housing to a large extent. And so it's not the same kind of urban center that we see with like Reforma in Mexico City. It's closer to like a Zocalo type zone. And what we see here is that there is a higher population of Albanians in that northern region, exactly where we see the violence taking place. Not in the southern region as much. They move out of that southern region. Okay, and so the north is where we expect the violence. The north is yes where we see it. So it's not necessarily the centrality of the location itself. It's even dividing that center region. We can see that in the north, we still have more violence. Does that address the question?
Yes, thank you so much. Remember, you can write your questions or comments in the chat window of this platform. Well, I would have another question, Doctor. It's for me very interesting, and for all of us, your background of international studies and your research interest in urban studies. How, having in mind this very complicated historical context in the city, how hermetic or how open were the authorities and the access to information to talk about these housing policies and this access to the housing functionaries? What do you think?
We benefited strongly from the contributions of one of my co-authors, Alexandra Krustic. She's from the city of Scotia, and the contacts were her direct personal contacts. So it was fairly easy for us to acquire the interviews as a result. We also were able to obtain archival data because she went twice at this point and is planning a third trip actually for more interviews, but was able to go and obtain some of the documents we wouldn't otherwise have been able to access. So I think we benefited strongly from the composition of our team.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, I don't see some questions. Okay, I would have another one if you allow me. What happened with the housing that was built after the earthquake of 1963? Is it still on feed? What happened with this housing and the state of in general of the quality of this housing? You mentioned that it was built, if I understood well, in a very lower technical manner, not too very appropriate or adequate to the conditions of the inhabitants. Could you maybe detail this topic of this post of this reconstruction housing?
I wish I could speak more to that question. It makes me wish Alexandra was here because she could give a better answer than I can. But it is my understanding that housing remained occupied for quite a substantial period of time and largely by minority populations.
Thank you, Doctor. There's a question here. It's interesting to know and learn from a distance about this place. Is there any type of public policy to reduce violence, and how does it affect urban planning? It's the question of Wendy.
Thank you for the question, Wendy. I think there is quite a bit that public policy does to try to reduce violence. In this context, I think the interest lies in what inadvertently happened that provoked violence as a result of public policy. We see an increase in violence in certain areas because of the lack of consideration for what might happen if populations were hyper-concentrated as opposed to further integrated. We might see, for example, an opposite scenario where we have the distribution of housing by the state reflecting less division along ethnic lines, and we might have seen less conflict.
Thank you, Doctor. There's a comment of Alma Rosa Moreno. She says, I don't really understand the idea of ethnic in the context of Yugoslavia, because in Mexico it refers to very marginalized communities. Does it refer to the same idea?
Yes, very much so. For example, the Roma are considered like second-class citizens inherently. They're extremely marginalized to the point where they don't engage in political processes because they don't see the value of it. Albanians were the only ethnic minority in this particular context that came close to being a little less marginalized, having some of the benefits that you might expect would help them to climb out of the same situations of poverty that we see provoked in highly marginalized communities in the Mexican context, right? But the idea here is that they had just enough to make them hurt, but not enough to really alleviate the situation.
Thank you, Doctor. I would like to ask you, we understand that this is still a research in progress, and you showed some preliminary analysis of the housing typology. We understand that this is also an interdisciplinary team, which is very interesting for us. How how do you work with the different disciplines and scales to integrate this research? For example, are you going to go deeper with these housing typologies, maybe from an anthropology perspective to understand better these housing typologies in the context of this difficult political framework context would be the question.
We are planning multiple pieces of research for this project. We don't have an anthropologist on the team, but the architecture and urban planning aspect, Alexandra will be leading another paper. This one is the political science geared paper, where we're looking more at this level of violence that takes place in political violence interactions. But in the paper led by Alex, what we'll be looking at is specifically the different types of housing stock and the way that they're constructed, the access to green space and the physical distribution of space and architectural planning that takes place and how that affects the social process around it. So I don't know if that helps to answer the question, but.
Yes, well, we will be very glad to hear the results of the final of the research in a near future. Alma Rosa is asking if we can contact you, if you could let us your email address or your social media contacts. Thank you so much. We have it on the chat window. And well, we thank you so much, Dr. Boyce. We are really sorry about your computer. We hope it's solved soon, and we will be very happy if we see you again in this event. This was organized by the students of the School of Architecture and Engineering of Instituto Politécnico Nacional with 4 programs, doctorate, master, and specializations. And we thank you. Thank you so much for this conference. Thank you, Dr. Boyce.
Thank you as well for the opportunity to be here. And I hope that the research was interesting. I know it can be difficult to connect across disciplines, but I hope that I didn't bore anyone too much. Feel free to email me at any point at christina.boyce@cide.edu. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to share our research with you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and we are very happy to have her at this event. We appreciate your assistance and look forward to working on future research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience. We kindly invite you to the next session in English. We are going to have precisely the presentation of Dr. Alexandra Kristich and the book Cities and COVID at 15 hours, 3 p.m. We hope we see you, all of you, and have a nice